Hello everyone and welcome to the chapter number 12 of Blender Master Course Deform Modifiers in Blender. If you are new to this course, then do watch the previous 12 chapters from the link of the playlist in the pinned comment. So in the previous chapter, that is chapter number 11, we discussed about all the 18 generate modifiers, and in this chapter we'll be discussing about these 16 modifiers of the deform modifier category. We'll be understanding the working of each one, so let's begin with it. So deform modifiers basically help us to change the shape of an object without adding any new geometry to it. And the first modifier, after clicking on Modify Properties Editor and then going to Add Modifier and selecting Deform, is the Armature modifier. And armatures are used when you are modeling your character and rigging it. Therefore, we will explore this armature modifier in a future chapter of this course when we understand about character creation. And the next one on our list is the cast modifier. But before applying the cast modifier, let's tab into the edit mode of this cube and let's add some vertices to it by subdividing it. So I'll click on subdivide and let's go to the subdivide menu and increase the number of cuts to around 4. Now tab into the object mode. The reason why I did this was that the cast modifier works better when your object has a high number of vertices. So let's go back in the object mode and go to add modifier, and in the deform section select cast. Is now looking somewhat like a sphere, even though it's not perfectly spherical, but it still looks like a sphere. And that's what this cast modifier do. It basically deforms the primitive object such as the cube that we selected here and changes its shape to the shape that is mentioned here. Since here the shape selected is a sphere, so the cube in our scene is deformed to turn into a sphere. And to make it into a perfect sphere, you have to increase the factor from here, and if I click on it and enter 1, then you can see that our object looks like a perfect sphere now. But if you increase the factor beyond 1, then you can see that our object is forming a very odd shape which we don't want. So we'll change the factor to 1 and it will perfectly change its shape to sphere. Similarly, there are also other shapes available here. If I select cylinder here, then it will change to a cylinder. Now let's try to create a simple animation using this cast modifier. To do this, I'll delete this and let's add a Suzanne or the monkey model in our scene. Now go to add modifier and in deform select cast modifier. Now let's change this factor to 0, and at 0 you can see that our model has the original appearance, and you might notice that after this factor value there's a small dot here, and this dot is used for animating stuff. So if I click on this small dot, it will basically add a keyframe at the frame number 1 here, and if I drag this to increase the space of the timeline and take this timeline cursor to around 100, and now if I change the factor value to 1 and if I again click here, then basically what it does is that it will assign the frame 100 this factor value of 1. So if I go on frame 0, then this frame will have a factor value of 0, and if I drag it, then you can see that the factor value is increasing, and at frame 100 the factor value is 1. So if I go to frame 0 and press space to play the animation, then you can see that our Suzanne model is transforming into a shape like a sphere. So you can use this cast modifier to make a simple animation that shows your object deforming into a shape like a sphere or a cylinder or a cuboid, and that's all in this cast modifier. And the next modifier on our list is the curve modifier, but before that let's delete it by pressing X and add a cube in our scene. Now for understanding the curve modifier properly, you need to have a knowledge of the curves also. But currently in this course we have not covered curves, but still we'll try to understand the basics of the curve modifier in this chapter. So press Shift plus A and click on the curve section here and select this Bezier curve from the list. Now we can't see it in our scene, so press G and Y to move it in Y direction. Now it appears like this. Now we'll select our cube and tab into the edit mode. Let's reduce its size in the Z direction and scale it up in the X direction, and right click and select subdivide, and we'll increase the number of cuts to around 9 or 10, and let's tab back into the object mode. Now select this curve and to increase its size press S on your keyboard. Now select this cube, click on add modifier, and in deform select curve modifier. Now in the curve object here you have to add this curve, so click on the eyedropper and select this curve. Now you can see that our cube object is deformed, and if I now select this curve and tab into the edit mode, and if I deselect, you can see that this curve has 2 vertices, and if I select one of it and if I press R to rotate it, then you will notice that there are same transformations being applied on this cube also, and this is what the curve modifier do. Basically, this curve modifier uses the shape of your curve to deform your mesh object, and you will understand this in a better way when we'll cover the curves in Blender in the upcoming chapters. So now let's tab back into the object mode, and now the next modifier to explore is the displace modifier. So press A and X to delete all, and now let's add a plane in our scene by pressing Shift plus A, and in mesh select plane. Let's tab into the edit mode and let's subdivide it and increase the number of cuts to 8 or maybe 16. Now what I'm gonna do is that I'll select some of these vertices, some random vertices, and make a vertex group. Now we studied about creating a vertex group in our previous chapter. So click on this icon which will open the data properties editor, and in the vertex group section click on this plus icon to add a new vertex group and click on assign. This would create a group of all these vertices in this vertex group. Now if I go to the object mode and if I click on the add modifier, and after that if I go to deform and select displace, we see that the entire plane object is displaced upwards, and you can control this with the strength option here. But this is not the real use of this modifier, because you can use it to displace your vertices in a vertex group as per a particular texture. To see what it really means, click on this vertex group option and select this group. So basically what it did is that it displaced the group of vertices that we created, and with the strength tool you can change the displacement of these vertices. Now suppose I go to this texture tab here, and if I create a new texture and let's change its type to noise. Now you might be thinking that we have not covered textures yet, we don't know what texture is. So you don't need to worry about that, because we'll be covering textures completely in our upcoming chapters. But for now let's just see what happens on applying a texture. And so now let's go to the modify properties editor, and if I now try to change the strength, then you will notice that the vertices are getting displaced as per the texture we have applied. Let's set this mid-level to 0, and now you can try testing this strength option. For those of you who are new to this Blender software and have not worked with textures yet, it might be difficult to understand this displace modifier, but later on when we will cover textures completely in this course, then you will completely understand every concept of this displace modifier properly. And now is the time for our next modifier, that is hook modifier. And this one is a simple modifier. So let's press X to delete this, and let's add a new cube in our scene. Now tab into the edit mode, and to understand what a hook modifier is, we have to select one of these vertices, and to apply this hook modifier there is a special shortcut available. Press Ctrl plus H, and from this menu select hook to new object. Now if we go back to the object mode, we notice that apart from this cube there is this empty object also created. Now this empty object does not have any volume, it just exists in our scene, and if I select this cube, then you can see that this hook modifier has been applied to it. And to see what it does, select this empty object, and if I try to move it, then we notice that the vertex that we selected will also start displacing with it. And all this is happening in the object mode, and if I left click, then my object will get deformed. And that's the use of the hook modifier. The hook modifier allows you to manipulate or animate selected vertices of a mesh while in the object mode. The vertex with which this empty object was hooked will also move when you press G and try to move it. And that is the complete use of hook modifier. And the next one on our list is the Laplacian deform modifier. So press A and X to delete all. Now this Laplacian modifier is a very interesting and a very useful modifier. So let's understand it by adding a cube in our scene. Tab into the edit mode and right click to apply subdivide, and let's increase the number of cuts to 3, or maybe let's increase it to something like 8. And now to see how the Laplacian modifier works, we need to connect hook to this corner vertex. For this, with this corner vertex selected, I'll press Ctrl plus H for the hook menu, and I'll select hook to new object. Now this vertex has a hook attached to it. Similarly, I'll do the same with this one also. Press Ctrl plus H and select hook to new object. And with this one also, Ctrl plus H and select hook to new object. So I've done it with 3 of my corner vertices of this face. Now if you want to select any individual hook, then you have to press Ctrl plus H and go to select hook and select that particular hook. For example, if I select this hook, then this one got selected. Similarly, I press Ctrl plus H again and I'll select the second hook, and Ctrl plus H for the third hook also. And here you can see the modify section that there are 3 hook modifiers applied for the 3 individual vertices. And now we'll create a group of these 3 hooks by pressing Ctrl plus G and then click on assign to new group. And now if I go to the modify section and click on add modifier, and in deform I'll select Laplacian deform. Now I'll scroll down, and in the anchor weights we'll select that group of hooks. Let's tab into the object mode, and now we'll click on bind. So let's see what it does. If I select this hook and press G to move it, then I observe that the object is also getting transformed. And similarly, if I select this hook and try to move it, then it also does the same thing, that is the object is getting transformed here also. And this is the use of the Laplacian deform modifier. So in this way you can use these hooks to deform the cube or any other object that you want to animate, and that's all in the Laplacian deform modifier. And now the next one that we'll see is the lattice modifier. By using the lattice modifier, you can easily deform your object, especially if it has a large number of vertices. So press A and X to delete this setup, and let's add a sphere in our scene by pressing Shift plus A and select UV sphere. Let's move it in X direction like this. The reason for choosing this UV sphere is that this UV sphere has a high number of vertices, which is a basic requirement of using the lattice modifier. Now to use this lattice modifier, we need to add a lattice in our scene. So press Shift plus A, and here you can find the lattice object. So click on lattice, and this is what a lattice looks like. Now we'll select our UV sphere, click on add modifier, and in the deform select lattice. Now in this object section, click on this eyedropper and select this lattice here. Now this lattice has been assigned to this sphere. So we'll select this lattice and let's move it in X direction like this and let's scale it up. Now with this lattice selected, if I tab into the edit mode, and now if I select one of its vertices from here and try to move it, you will notice that the UV sphere will also show the transformations. And this is how the lattice modifier is used. Basically, if you will notice, all the deform modifiers will help you to change the shape or structure of your object or your mesh very easily. Like in this case, with this lattice object, you just need to select your vertices and move them around, and your object will also transform. And so that's all in this lattice modifier. And the next modifier on our list is the mesh deform modifier. So the mesh deform modifier deforms your mesh with a cage mesh, and it is very similar to a lattice modifier, but instead of being restricted to the regular grid layout of a lattice, a cage can be modeled to fit around the mesh object being deformed. And to see what it really means, let's go to the object view and press A, and then X to delete all objects. And now let's add a Suzanne or the monkey model in our scene, and to make a cage around it, let's add a cube. Let's turn on the X-ray mode to see both the objects properly. Let's tab into the edit mode with the cube selected and scale it up in X direction so that it completely covers the monkey or the Suzanne model. And let's subdivide this cube 2 to 3 times so that it would be easy to deform our monkey or the Suzanne model. Now select the Suzanne model, go to add modifier, and in the deform section, select mesh deform. Now we need to add this cube as the object here. So click on this eyedropper and select this cube, and you have to click on bind. It might take 1 or 2 seconds based on your PC, and then it will show unbind here, which means that both the objects are binded with each other and the mesh deform will work now. So let's select this cube, tab into the edit mode and select some of the vertices from the top face. And now if I try to move them, let's see what happens. So I'll press G and try to move them, and you can see that our Suzanne model is also deforming. And this is what the mesh deform modifier does. It allows you to create a cage around your object, and then you can easily edit your object shape or structure with the help of the vertices of this cage. Because whatever transformation you do to this cage, or basically its vertices or edges, the same transformations will also apply to the Suzanne or the monkey model or whichever object you have added in your scene. And now it's the time to explore the next modifier, that is the Shrinkwrap modifier. As the name suggests, the Shrinkwrap modifier takes a mesh and shrinks it down, basically wrapping the mesh around another object. And to practically see how it works, let's go to the object mode, turn off the X-ray mode, press A to select all and X to delete, and let's add a new UV sphere in our scene. Also we'll add a plane, move it upwards in the Z direction, enter the edit mode with this plane selected, and let's scale it down, and let's apply subdivision 2 to 3 times and return to the object mode. Now to see the effect of Shrinkwrap modifier properly, we need to assign some colors to these objects. First let's go to the material preview mode. With this plane selected, go to the materials panel, click on new and assign any random color to it. So let's assign it blue color. Now we'll select this sphere and let's also assign it a color. So let's assign it yellow color. Now to make its surface smooth, we'll right click and select shade smooth. Now select this plane, go to the modifiers option, click on add modifier, and in deform select Shrinkwrap, and we observe that nothing happens. That's because we have to choose our target object on which this plane would wrap around. So click on this eyedropper and select this sphere, and now you can see that the plane is wrapped around the sphere in a way that it's not even properly visible. To fix this, we need to increase the offset a little bit. So let's change this offset to a very small value like 0.012, and now the plane is properly visible, and you can see that the plane is now wrapped around the sphere, and that's how the Shrinkwrap modifier is used. So you can basically use this shrink modifier whenever you want to wrap one object over another. And now let's explore the next modifier, that is simple deform modifier. So let's return to the solid mode by pressing Z and move your cursor towards solid. Press A and X to delete all. Now let's add a cube in our scene, tab into the edit mode, and let's scale it up in the Z direction, and let's apply subdivide. Increase the number of cuts to 8. I have taken 8 cuts just randomly. You can even increase the number to 10 or decrease it to 6 or anything. Now the modifier that we are going to use, that is the simple deform modifier. It basically takes the origin point as its reference by default, that is where this 3D cursor is located. And to ensure that it's applied properly, we need to move this cube upwards in the Z direction like this. Now let's come out of the edit mode. Now we'll go to add modifier, and in deform section click on simple deform. Here you can see that it has created a strange effect on our cube. Since the twist option is selected here, so it has twisted our cube in the X direction. To see the effect properly, we can change this angle from here, and we can even change the axis from here. Let's keep the axis to Z axis, and let's increase the angle like this, so it will create this beautiful twist effect on our object. So at 360 degree, you can see that our cube has completely twisted, and this is how it looks. Let's try the other options also, like this bend option. So you can change the angle from here like this, and even the axis from here. So let's set it to X axis, and if I decrease the angle, then you can see that at 0, our object look like this. But if we increase the angle, then our object will begin to bend. And this is extremely useful if you want to animate your objects and want to show them like bending or twisting, then this tool is very useful. Let's try the taper effect. Let's change the axis to Y and let's increase this factor. So you can see how this is creating a tapering effect on our cube. Similarly, if I go to the stretch option and change the axis to Z axis and increase the factor, then you can see that it is creating a beautiful stretch effect on our cube. So if you want to animate your stuff and it involves twisting, bending, tapering or stretching, then you can use this simple deform modifier and then you can do it in seconds. And now let's come to the next modifier, that is the smooth modifier. To understand it, let's delete it first and let's add a monkey or the Suzanne model. Now what the smooth modifier does is that it smoothens the mesh object by softening the angles between the adjacent faces, and this even shrinks the size of the original object. To see how it practically works, with this selected object, go to add modifier, click on deform, and in the deform section select smooth, and if I zoom in, you might notice that there is no much visible effect on it, but if I change the factor to 0, you can see how it originally looked, and now if I change it to 1, we can see that its size has shrunk and its surface is much smoother now. You can even increase the smoothness further by increasing this factor from here, but if you try to increase it too much, then your object will be destroyed and it won't be helpful. So keep the factor to around 1 or 2 to see the best results. And now the next modifier on our list is the smooth corrective modifier. Now this modifier is mostly used to smooth the mesh during character creation process, and so it requires the knowledge of character modeling. As a result, we won't be covering it in this chapter right now, and so let's move to the next one, that is the smooth Laplacian modifier. For that, I'll delete this Suzanne model. Now the smooth Laplacian modifier is used to smooth a mesh which has become irregular after its vertices have been manipulated during detailed modeling. And to understand this practically, let's add a plane in our scene, enter the edit mode and subdivide it 2 to 3 times so that it gets more vertices. Now to understand the smooth Laplacian modifier, we have to make its surface irregular first. So select any random vertex, turn on proportional editing by pressing O and move this vertex upwards, and scroll up your mouse wheel to reduce the circle of influence, and we'll left click to finalize. And now if I go back to the object mode, you can see that the surface of this plane is very irregular now, and to smoothen this surface we can use the smooth Laplacian modifier. So go to the modifier properties editor, click on add modifier, and in the deform section select smooth Laplacian. Now to remove this irregularity or basically smoothen it, you need to increase this lambda factor from here, and now you can see that our surface of this plane has become much more regular than before, and if I further increase it, then it becomes much more regular, and this is the use of the Laplacian smooth modifier. In simple words, you can understand it in this way, that it helps to smoothen an irregular surface of any mesh. And now the next modifier on our list is the surface deform modifier, and to see how it works, let's delete this and add a cube in our scene. Tab into the edit mode, let's scale it up in Y direction like this, and to increase the number of vertices we'll subdivide it 2 to 3 times. Now return to the object mode, and the surface deform modifier will require another object in your scene which will be used as a target, and any transformation that you will do to that object will also be seen on this object's surface. For example, if I add a plane in my scene and rotate it in Y direction by 90 degrees, tab into the edit mode and scale it up like this, and let's also scale it up in Y direction. And we should increase the number of vertices in this plane also. So let's subdivide it 2 to 3 times. Now let's go back to the object mode and let's apply the surface deform modifier to this cube. So I'll select this cube here, go to add modifier, and in deform category select surface deform. Now we have to set this plane as the target object. So click on this eyedropper and select this plane. And to bind both the objects, you have to click on this bind button. Now if I select this plane and tab into the edit mode, and now if I randomly select some vertices and try to transform them, like moving them in upward direction like this, then we notice that our cube is also getting transformed in the same way. Also if I try to rotate it, then this cube will also show the same transformations. Similarly, if I scale it up, then also this cube is deforming, and that's the use of the surface deform modifier. Basically, the surface deform modifier is similar to the mesh deform modifier that we previously discussed. The only difference is that the controlling mesh, that is the plane in this case, does not have to surround the object, and this is the use of this modifier. Let's go to the object mode now. And the next one is very interesting, and it's the warp modifier. To understand it, let's delete all this. Press Shift plus A to add a plane in our scene. Now let's tab into the edit mode, and to increase the number of vertices, we'll apply subdivide. Let's increase the number of cuts to around 16 and increase its size like this. Now we'll come out of the edit mode, and to use the warp modifier, you need to add 2 empty objects in your scene. For this, press Shift plus A to add object, and in the empty, select plane axis. Let's duplicate it by using Shift plus D and move it in Z direction like this. One of the empty objects should be at the bottom and the other one should be upwards in the Z direction. Now let's select this plane and apply the modifier. So in deform category, we'll select the warp modifier. Now you can see that there are 2 options here. One is object from and the other is object to. So we'll assign one of these empty objects to object from and the other one to object to. So let's click on this eyedropper and select this one, that is the empty object, as the object from, and click on the eyedropper of this object to, and we'll select the other empty object, and now you can see that something has happened here. So basically the warp modifier allowed you to deform your mesh object in object mode by manipulating the target objects, that is the empty objects that we have added in our scene. To show what it means, I'll select this empty object, and if I try to move it, you will notice that our plane object is also deforming. So basically the working of this modifier is such that it starts from the object that we have entered in object from, that is the one at the 3D cursor, and it will show the deformation till the object 2, that is the object that we have added in this object 2 section. And you can even change the strength from here, and this is the warp modifier. So selecting this empty object and moving it will deform it, and if you select this plane and change the strength, then also you can see the changes or the transformations in your object. And now is the time for the last modifier of this chapter, the wave modifier. And it's an amazing modifier and a very simple one to learn. So let's start with it. So I'll press A and X to delete all, and let's add a plane in our scene. Go to the edit mode, and let's subdivide it. Let's keep the number of cuts to 16, and let's scale it up also. Return to the object mode, and now we can apply the wave modifier. So click on add modifier. In deform section, select wave modifier, and you can see that the object is now transformed. But that's not enough. If you press on this play animation button, then you can see that our plane is showing a wave animation. And from the wave menu here, you can even change the height of your wave like this. Let's reduce it. Similarly, you can also change the width of your waves and also the narrowness of your waves like this. And also if you go to the time section here, you can even change the speed of your waves. For example, if I increase it to the maximum level, then it will be very fast. And if I reduce it to something near 0, then you can see that the speed of our waves has reduced. And that's all in the wave modifier. And we have now covered deform modifiers in this chapter. But before ending this chapter, there's something to tell you. The purpose of creating these two chapters, that is this chapter and the previous one, is not that you will memorize each and every modifier of Blender, but to make you understand the fundamentals and the working of each modifier. But if you want to learn each and every modifier in Blender, which again is not really mandatory, you will require a lot of practice for that. And to start with, you can add and select random objects in your Blender scene and try applying different modifiers to see what happens. And from the next chapter, we'll be starting with materials, textures and nodes. The next chapter will be the chapter number 13, where we'll understand the basics of node components. So if you are new to this channel, then subscribe, smash that like button and press that notification bell so that you can get timely updates about the upcoming chapters. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.